Well, shalom, shalom. I just want to welcome everyone here today to the Sabbath Day conference call. And today the discussion topic is Enoch's calendar versus Jehovah's calendar. And this evidence will show that the calendar or the calendars in the Book of Enoch contradict each other, and they are not inspired by Jehovah, and they're not supported in Scripture or nature. In spite of having nearly 60 different authors in the Hebrew canon, there's remarkably uniformity throughout, considering it was written over 1,500 years ago. Well, I mean over a 1,500 period of time. So in comparison, the writings in the Book of Enoch may have been written over a greater span of time, but had considerably fewer authors with many contradictions. If they were all divinely inspired, there would be uniformity throughout the Book of Enoch. Did Enoch write the book that bears his name? No, not all of it anyway. The Book of Enoch was added to several times after the flood over many hundreds of years by anonymous authors. And when an anonymous prophecy came in, it was awarded to Enoch, since he had never died. The introduction to the Book of Enoch admits to these additions, stating so without equivocation. Evidence below. Admittedly, there are scholars who disagree, believing that every word was inspired. So already discretion must be used. Some scholars argue that the Book of Enoch should be included in the canon. The Richard Lawrence translation, in parentheses, the first translation of the Book of Enoch into English in 1821, quotes Charles F. Potter as saying the Book of Enoch was itself in the Bible for 5 centuries and which should be restored to the canon of Holy Writ, unquote. What Enoch actually wrote, in parentheses it says, and that should be at least be some of the book in question, unquote, should be in the canon, but not anonymous manuscripts from false prophets or from lying pens of the scribes. And Jeremiah 8:8 talks about the lying pens of scribes. So if these issues exist, and they clearly do, then every truth seeker should seek to make the effort to discern what came from Enoch and what, if anything, did not.
This study will examine the translation by R.H. Charles. The preface from the Book of Enoch, that is R.H. Charles's translation, says this on page 6. To the biblical scholar and to the student of Jewish Christian theology, First Enoch is the most important Jewish work written between 200 B.C. and 100 A.D. Some scholars say it was 300 B.C. to 100 A.D. It pains me that the publishers of the Lawrence translation were so exuberant with their praise of the book, or so dishonest. But a book that was written from 300 B.C. to 100 A.D. is not authored by Enoch, who lived some 3,000 years B.C. It is seldom that authors attain the immortality which they hope for, and it is still more seldom that anonymous authors achieve this distinction. And yet, it is just such a distinction that the authors of the Book of Enoch have achieved, that from the introduction to the Book of Enoch by R.H. Charles, 1912 edition.
And I'll leave some of these links below. So this is a description of the book sold on Amazon. This is what Amazon says. R.H. Charles provides a definitive translation of one of the most noted apocalyptic works still in existence, often described as the lost book of the Bible. The Book of Enoch seems to have been written in Palestine by several different authors in the 1st and 2nd centuries B.C. There were no Pharisees or Sadducees before the flood, so these calendars were not the one Enoch practiced. Okay, and this paragraph talks about the Pharisees.
According to the translator R.H. Charles, quote, as the various parts of the book clearly belong to different dates, diversity of authorship is what one is naturally led to expect. And if this can indeed be no shadow, and of this there can be indeed no shadow of doubt. That again from the introduction to the Book of Enoch, R.H. Charles. Regarding the point of the 364 days to the year, which the writer of Enoch chapters 72 to 32 makes, Charles says, quote, he did this only through sheer incapacity for appreciating a thing better. For he must have been acquainted with the solar year of 365 and a quarter days. His acquaintance with the Greek cycle shows this. The author's reckoning of the year at 364 days may be partly due to his opposition to heathen systems, and partly to the fact that 364 is divisible by 7 and amounts to 52 weeks exactly. In any case, the author of chapters 72 and 73 is opposed to the lunar year, the Pharisaic way of reckoning time, and this is an important point in favor of Sadducean authorship. It will be noted that this book was written in post-Maccabean times. It was after the Maccabean struggle that the Sadducees and Pharisees appeared as parties definitively opposed to one another. In other words, there were no Pharisees and Sadducees before the flood, so these calendars were not one Enoch the son of Jared, practiced.
Okay, so the introduction to the book also says that these many authors are in agreement and actually cites their uniformity, and then, strangely enough, goes on to describe the conflicting views between the authors of Enoch. So the Book of Enoch comes from many writers. So this is in the introduction also. The Book of Enoch comes from many writers in almost as many periods. It touches upon every subject that could have arisen in the ancient schools of the prophets. Nearly every religious idea appears in a variety of forms, and if these are studied in relation to their context and dates, we cannot fail to observe that in the age to which the Enoch literature belongs, there is movement everywhere and nowhere dogmatic fixity and finality. And that's from the introduction to the Book of Enoch by R.H. Charles, the translation, 1912 edition. And here's another quote from it. From what has been already said, it is clear that no unity of time, authorship, or teaching is to be looked for in the Book of Enoch. So the book itself claims to be written by Enoch, the seventh from Adam. The very first verse reads, this is the quote from Enoch 1:1. The words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the elect and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all wicked and godless are to be removed. Later, Enoch 37 notes, the second vision which he saw, the vision of wisdom, which Enoch the son of Jared, the son of Mahalalel, the son of Canaan, the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, saw. Enoch 37:1. Clearly, the claim is that Enoch, parentheses, the Enoch of Genesis 5:18 through 24, wrote this book. But some of the information in the book itself proves that he did not write it.
First point, if you do the math, the genealogy of Genesis 5:3 through 18 has Enoch born in the year 622. At 65, Enoch begat Methuselah, Genesis 5:21. Enoch walked with Yahweh for 300 years, then was taken from the earth at age 365. Genesis 5:23 through 24 bringing the time, that's from Genesis, that passage, bringing the time of Enoch's departure to the year 987. The Book of Enoch contains an account of the birth of Noah. It has Enoch telling Methuselah, quote, "And now, my son, go and announce to thy son Lamech that this son who is born is really his, and that this is not a falsehood." And when Methuselah had heard the words of his father Enoch, for he had shown him everything that was secret, he returned after his having seen him, and called the name of that son Noah, for he will make glad the earth for all destruction. That's Enoch 107, verses 2 and 3. The problem is that Noah was born in the year 1056. That's Genesis 5:25 through 29. About 69 years after Enoch departed this earth. So how is it that Enoch historically writes of the events of Genesis 6 and the account of Noah when he was several decades removed from the planet? Point 2. Furthermore, Book of Enoch chapter 6 begins with an account of the events found in Genesis 6. Quote, "And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Jaz, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. They swore they all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were all 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And these are the names of their leaders. And I'm going to bypass all the names there. And then it says, these are their chiefs of 10. That's Enoch 6, 1 through 8. According to this account, the angels lusted after the daughters of men in the days of Jared, Enoch's father. According to Genesis 5, Jared died when Noah was 366 years old, 234 years before the flood. That from Genesis 7:11. So by comparing the record of both Enoch and Genesis, these events occurred sometime after Noah was 366 years old. There is no way to tell when the sons of Yah took the daughters of men as wives, from Genesis 6, 1 through 2. But immediately after they did so, Elohim declares that man would have only 120 more years, that's Genesis 6, 3, before the coming flood, which gives the appearance of the events in Genesis 6, 1 through 2, took place in the days of Noah, rather in the days of Jared, who had died 114 years earlier. With this narrative flowing all the way to chapter 10, the author clearly writes of events he would have no knowledge of if he truly were the biblical Enoch, the son of Jared.
Okay, point number 3. Enoch 13:7 says, quote, And I went off and sat down at the waters of Dan, in the land of Dan, to the south of the west of Hermon. I read their petition till I fell asleep, unquote. So this is not a prophetic statement. Dan, the son of Israel, lived about 600 years after the flood of Noah. It was not until 1,000 years after the flood of Noah that the nation of Israel came into existence when Moses led the descendants of Israel out of Egypt. One of the 12 tribes of Israel was the tribe of Dan, after which a portion of the nation of Israel was given to the tribe of Dan. The question is, how did Enoch know this was the land of Dan 1,600 years before there was a Dan?
Is the Book of Enoch inspired? Quote, conflicting views are advanced on the Messiah, the Messianic kingdom, the origin of sin, Sheol, the final judgment, the resurrection, and the nature of the future life. There is an elaborate angelology, and demonology, and much space is devoted to the calendar and the heavenly bodies and their movements. Babylonian influences are here manifest, and a slight degree Greek. That from the introduction of Enoch by R.H. Charles, 1912. Conflicting views mean that different men wrote on the same subject, and their writings were combined into one book, as it is completely untenable that one man would write such conflicting views on the same topic. In either case, divine inspiration is out of the question, as Yahweh would not have one man write conflicting views, nor would he have successive prophets write conflicting views. He is not the author of confusion. So, I will show you that some of the calendars presented in the Book of Enoch are of pagan origin, while others are found in Scripture. And I maintain that observing the pagan calendars as if they were inspired, simply because they're found in the Book of Enoch or added by an author of unknown quality, is quite dangerous and a counterintuitive proposition.
The introduction also offers this arbitrary saying that the Book of Enoch, quote, contained much of a questionable character, and from the 4th century of our era it fell into discredit. And that's also from the same source with R.H. Charles. I can't imagine why any genuine writings from Enoch would fall into discredit, but considering the lack of unity, the lack of fixity, and the overall lack of continuity by its many obviously uninspired authors, it is clear why the Book of Enoch would fall from grace. Now it's up to honest men to discern what was actually written by Enoch and to segregate these writings from the mixed bag of questionable writings added by these other authors. Considering the dark history of this book, it would be naive for anyone to accept the Book of Enoch as a whole as being divinely inspired. The Book of Enoch was mostly written in the years of silence, so it follows that it could not have been an inspired book because no prophets of Jehovah then existed. We should treat the Book of Enoch and other books like it in the same manner we do the other apocryphal writings. Some of what the Apocrypha says is true and correct, but at the same time, much of it is false or historically inaccurate. Treat them as interesting but fallible historical writings, not as the inspired, authoritative word of Yah. Conflicting views are found in the Book of Enoch. Now we're going to cover some of these. There are many problems between Enoch and Scripture, some already addressed, as well as unforced internal errors, and here are more. Genesis 5:23 reads, "So all the days of Enoch were 365 years." And then in Enoch, chapter 60, verse 1, it reads as follows, "In the year 500, in the 7th month, on the 14th day of the month, in the life of Enoch, if this," quote, "in the year of 500, unquote, was not a reference to Enoch's age, but rather the year 500 since creation, then this is further evidence that these are not inspired writings, since if the ages of the fathers were added up as they begat sons, Enoch wasn't even born until the year 622.
More examples of the conflicting views found in the Book of Enoch dealing with fallen angels. The first list has 19 names, the second 21, many of which are quite different. Such internal contradictions indicate that Yahweh is not behind the Book of Enoch. Dealing with the origin of evil, in Enoch 69:11, the origin of moral evil is placed on Adam. In contrast, in Enoch chapters 6, 7, and 15, the root of evil was traced to the lust of the watchers, that is, the fallen angels who lusted after the daughters of men, in Genesis 6. Dealing with rain, in Genesis 6, Elohim says that rain had not come upon the earth until the flood. But in Enoch chapter 2 and elsewhere in the translation, says that there was always rain. Marriage, or dealing with marriage, in Enoch chapters 6 through 26 through 36, marriage is magnified and honored, and fruitful wedlock is prophesied to take place in the Messianic kingdom. In contrast, a later shift in theology produced a Messianic kingdom that is wholly spiritual in nature, dealing with Messiah. In chapters 83 through 90, the coming Messiah is the head of a Messianic community, but has no special role to fulfill. In contrast, in chapters 37 through 71, are quite contrary. Now he bears several Messianic titles: Son of Man, the Elect One, the Righteous One, and naturally, Messiah, meaning the Anointed One, all of which found their way into the New Testament. Dealing with the Messianic kingdom, again, the points of division are clearly marked. In chapters in chapters 6 through 36, the coming kingdom of Yahweh is to be established on a purified earth, with Jerusalem at its center. The righteous will live patriarchal lives, having 1,000 children, and the Almighty will dwell with them. In contrast, in chapters 91 through 104, the idea is completely abandoned that the kingdom of Yahweh will be on earth. Rather, it will be a spiritual realm without horizons, which causes the recasting of many theological beliefs, dealing with final judgment. As expected, with the eternal Messianic kingdom on earth, final judgment precedes it, that in Enoch chapters 1 through 36. In contrast, and as mentioned above, in chapters 91 through 104, the Messianic kingdom is temporary, and as expected, the final judgment takes place at its close.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the calendar. Enoch had a 364-day calendar. The calendar issue. Okay, the introduction in the Book of Enoch by R.H. Charles, translation, 1917 edition, and there's the pages, reveals another contradiction. And this one's about the calendar. Enoch 74:12 says, "And the sun and the stars bring in all the years exactly, so that they do not advance or delay their position by a single day into eternity, but complete the years with perfect justice in 364 days. This is the keynote of the Book of Enoch, namely that time is to be reckoned by the sun, not by the moon, and is eternal." Then we come to chapter 80, which purports to tell us in detail of the laws by which the sun, moon, stars, and winds are governed based on Jewish conceptions and beliefs of that era. It is, however, different when we come to chapter 80, verses 2 to 8. The whole tone alters in these verses, in which it is said that owing to the sin of man, the moon and the sun will mislead them, as if man can cause the sun and moon to go astray somehow so that their cycles would no longer be perfect. That's just a thought added to there. And ethical thought is thus brought in, which is wholly lacking in the previous chapters of this book. This is also true of chapter 81. Scholars believe that neither of these chapters stood here originally. You know, and the scripture says that when men worship the sun and moon, that they will be misled. That's in Deuteronomy 4:15 through 16 and 19. But the cycles of the sun and moon will never change, and that is quoted in Psalms 89:35 to 37. Do the calendars in the Book of Enoch follow nature? And that would be the cycles of the sun and moon. In fact, most of the calendar statements in Enoch are in direct contention with nature. Since nature is the first gospel, a statement that is contrary to the evidence in nature is just as damning as a statement that is contrary to Scripture. So we're going to see now the Enoch calendar versus Jehovah's calendar. Here are 5 witnesses to prove that the calendars in Enoch were not the calendars that Enoch, the son of Jared, used. The calendar or calendars in the Book of Enoch contradict each other and are not inspired by Jehovah and not supported in Scripture or nature.
The year is 364 days in length in Enoch 72. It was divided into 4 91-day quarters, which is actually the ancient Babylonian and later recognized as the old solar year and originated long after the flood. Enoch, the man translated, only knew the calendar that Moses later recorded in Genesis. The author who added this 364-day year to the original Book of Enoch did so many years after the original Enoch was departed from the earth. The Old Testament year of 360 days consisted of 12 30-day months, producing 48 7-day weeks, 4 weeks per each month. Each of the 12 lunar months also had 2 days of new moon celebration. Point 2, continuing the thread started above, Enoch chapter 72 presents a year as having 364 days, probably because it was divisible by 7, making 52 weeks. If this connection can be deduced, another scriptural tenet has been subverted or ignored. David divided up the services of the priest into 24 groups. The lunar-solar year David knew was divided into 48 weeks, meaning the priest would serve twice a year. No application of David's system can be understood if the years consisted of 52 weeks. David observed the natural year and established his order of priests accordingly. The writer of this chapter of Enoch did nothing of the kind. Because the year had 364 days, which was divisible by 7, the assumption is that these are solar weeks. Please find a solar week defined in Scripture or in nature. 3. More evidence that the calendar months in the Book of Enoch are neither inspired nor based on natural fact. There are 8 30-day solar cycles in Enoch 72, where the sun rises and sets in one of 6 eastern portals or gates and sets in one of 6 west portals or gates, and 4 31-day cycles. These 31-day solar cycles include a 30-day cycle plus an equinox or solstice, which occurred 4 times a year. There are no solar cycles described in Scripture other than the day and the year. These divisions in the Book of Enoch are a description of solar months, which are also foreign to Scripture, which evidence not only the lack of inspiration, but also the pagan influence of the author. For the record, there are no 31-day lunar months in Scripture or nature. 4. In contrast to the year in Enoch 72, which is a 360-day year with 4 extra days, one added for each quarter of the year for solstice and equinox, the calendar in Enoch 73 speaks of extra days at the end of the year, verses 11 through 14. In Enoch's day, there were no extra days. Moses wrote that Noah only knew of 360-day lunar-solar years. In Scripture, the original months were all 30 days in length, for a total of 360 lunar-solar year. 12 30-day months, 12 times 30 equals 360-day year. Here is the evidence for this. Genesis 7:11 says that the flood began on the 17th day of the 7th month. Genesis 8:4 says the water prevailed on the face of the earth until the 17th day of the 7th month. That is 5 months. Genesis 7:24 and 8:3 say that the water prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. 150 divided by 5 is 30. So there were 5 consecutive 30-day months in Scripture, which is physically not possible with the current relationship between the earth and the moon. If Noah only knew 30-day months, then so did Enoch, who disappeared before the flood. So whoever wrote Enoch chapter 72 and 73 was not Enoch.
And here's a little chart showing the 17th day of the 2nd month, and it goes 150 days to the 17th day of the 7th month, making 5 30-day months. And we did YouTube about this, and you can look it up, about Noah's 360-day years.
Point 5. The wisdom, or Serich, an apocryphal book, also known as the Book of Ecclesiastes, or Saracide, was written by an Israelite named Yeshua ben Sarich, at the same time as the nameless Israelite who wrote Enoch, chapters 72 through 82, that is around 200 to 175 BC. In Sarich, chapter 43, the moon is revealed as the lunary which regulates the appointed time, that is, the feast. R.H. Charles, the translator of the Book of Enoch, in my collection, actually says that this in his footnotes for Enoch 2, that's on page 8, regarding Sarich 43. Quote, the moon is especially glorified since the Jewish feasts were celebrated in accordance with the moon phases. This last is, of course, a view in which the author of Enoch 72 to 82 would not have agreed, since he held that the only diviner of time was the sun. What an admission! Not only does he admit that the feast of Yahweh were regulated, not only does he admit that the feast of Yahweh were regulated by the moon's phases, not just the moon, he also admits that the author of the Book of Enoch did not agree. Same era, 2 Israelite authors, 2 different conclusions, one of which, Sarich's, is supported in Scripture.
Okay, so 5 witnesses is more than enough to prove that the calendars in Enoch were not the calendars that Enoch, the son of Jared, knew on earth. It also proves that these calendars recorded in Enoch are not inspired, are contrary to nature and Scripture, and do not even agree with themselves. There are different calendars presented in the Book of Enoch, and they can't all be the calendar Israel observed. One might disagree, saying, quote, on the contrary, there is evidence that the Israelites observed more than one calendar. The question is, which one is the feast day calendar, unquote. So I agree that Israel observed several calendars, but only one was inspired. The others were adopted because of their apostasy and the influence of paganism during their multiple captivities. The feast day calendar would be the original calendar, the one that is regulated by the moon. Moses and David so eloquently spoken of in Genesis 1:14 and Psalms 104:19. The way to determine the true calendar of Eden is to apply the evidence in Scripture to the evidence in nature, or vice versa. There is nothing in the natural world of the Old Testament that lines up with solar-only calendars in Enoch. It is said that the modern Gregorian calendar is solar-only, but even that is not true. So we know it says in Genesis 1:14 that Elohim said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. And we know Psalms 104:19 says, you made the moon to mark the seasons, and the sun knows when to set. The solar-only calendar is a man-made invention, and it tracks time very well. But that is not the calendar in Genesis 1:14. The entire thing is contrived, convoluted mess. Okay, now we're going to go over some of the things, the days, some of the things about the calendar. The days in Scripture. The days in Scripture are not midnight to midnight. Also, the sun is not out at midnight, that it might indicate that a new day has begun. So much for a solar day. How can the sun be an oath or signal that the new day has begun at midnight? The weeks in Scripture. The weeks in Scripture are not an unbroken sequence of 7 days in succession. The Gregorian calendar weeks are not linked to the sun either. Here's a question. Can you go outside, look at the sun, and tell me whether it is Sabbath or Saturday? No. Another question. Does the sun look different at the beginning of each week in order to be an oath or signal that a new week is about to begin? The answer is no. So much for a solar week. In the months in Scripture.
The months in Scripture are lunar. In fact, the English word month is from an older time when this was a recognized fact. The word month comes from munth, leaving a lunar legacy on a modern segment of time that is completely divorced from its lunar origin. Question: are the Gregorian months linked to any solar cycle? No. There is no sign in the heavens from the sun to announce the natural month. So much for a solar month. The years in Scripture. The years in Scripture are from spring to spring. That is, Aviv to Aviv, actually. Sure, the spring equinox is the sign in the cosmos that the spring has begun, and this is a solar measurement. But in Scripture, the moon of the first lunar month was also in the equation. So the year in Scripture is a lunar-solar event. The Gregorian year begins January 1st in the dead of winter. Question: is there any significant solar event that occurs only one time a year to announce January 1st? The answer is no. So much for a solar year.
So the Gregorian calendar is a fraud. The Gregorian calendar, we know, is a complete lying fraud claiming to be a solar calendar when in reality it is based solely upon the vain mechanisms of carnal man. Only the natural world of much more recent history tends to support the solar-only calendars in Enoch, forcing the conclusion that Enoch, the son of Jared, had nothing to do with their inclusion in the book that bears his name. Some accept the calendars in Enoch, even though they contradict themselves, over the one in Scripture. Some believe that because the Book of Enoch only supports a solar calendar, that this must be the calendar of Scripture, and seek many ways to discredit the lunar-solar calendar that is clearly presented in Scripture. However, considering that its many authors open the Book of Enoch to extreme scrutiny, why do some lend an ear to the calendars presented in this book over the obvious calendar presented in Scripture?
The lesser light spoken of in Genesis 1:14 was given equal billing with the greater light. Signs, that is oath, signal, or beacon, and season, that is moedim, set feast or times appointed, days, yom, heat as from the sun, and year, shani, that is year, revolutions of time, are all calendar related. The sun and moon both act as an oath, signal, or beacon. That's Joel 2:31 and Isaiah 13 verses 9 through 10. See also Luke 21:11 and Acts 2:19. And when applied to the calendar specifically, the Sabbath is called a sign, using the same Hebrew word, oath. 3 times in Exodus 31:13, Ezekiel 20:12, and 20:20. Can you go outside and look at the sun and tell when it's a Sabbath? No. That's because you are looking at the wrong luminary. The sun tells you a new day has begun, but the moon tells you what day of the month and week it is. The moon alone acts as a determiner of the set feast. That's Psalm 104:19, and the Sabbath is the named as the first feast listed in Leviticus 23. The sun alone dictates the day, that Genesis 3:5, Genesis 1:16, and Psalm 136:8. And the sun and moon work together to establish the new year. The moon specifically appointed out in Exodus 12:2. But the year is a solar event, the sun making a revolution back to the beginning of months each spring.
So the Book of Enoch states that the year is 364 days and will never change. And here's the quote. The book of the revolutions of the luminaries of heaven, according to their respective classes, their respective powers, their respective periods, their respective names, the places of their nativity, and their respective months, which Uriel, the holy angel who was with me, explained to me, he who conducts them, the whole account of them, according to every year of the world, forever, until the new work shall be expected, which will be eternal. This year is precisely 364 days. And that's a quote from Book of Enoch, chapter 71, verse 1, from the Richard Lawrence translation. So 360-day year. The year was originally 360 days in duration, and it is now 365.24 days, not 364. The only year that Enoch the prophet of Jehovah would have known is the 360-day year. And since the year is no longer 364 days in duration, these quotes from the Book of Enoch cannot be inspired.
Why was the Hebrew calendar fixed by Hillel II? It was in 341 AD, the 4th century, that Rome forced Hillel II to affix the Hebrew calendar to the solar cycle they observed. So Rome would never accidentally have to tolerate Passover falling on Easter. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, an ominous change started to take place that was to radically change the believer's concept of the Sabbath. Quote, this intimate connection between the week and the month was soon dissolved. It was certain that the week soon followed a development of its own, and it became the custom, without paying any regard to the days of the month, that is, the lunar month, so that the new moon no longer coincided with the first day of the month. That from Encyclopedia Biblica, 1899 edition, page 5290. Quote, the introduction of the custom of celebrating the Sabbath every 7th day, irrespective of the relationship of the day to the moon's phases, led to a complete separation from the ancient view of the Sabbath. That again from Encyclopedia Biblica, 1899 edition. Quote, with the development of the importance of the Sabbath as a day of consecration and the emphasis laid upon the significant number 7, the week became more and more divorced from its lunar connection. That from the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, Volume 10, 1943 edition.
There was not a single solar-only calendar anywhere in history until after the dent in Yah's clock, which occurred long after Enoch was translated, meaning he did not add these calendars to the book that bears his name. So we know that all the calendars in the world kept 360-day year, and the calendar was dented in 700 BC. So you can study that out further. But some of the supporters of the Book of Enoch have even gone so far as to say that Scripture never demands the observation of the moon. And here we go, Genesis 1:14-16 does talk about the moon. And Elohim said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, Moedim, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven, to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And Elohim made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also.
How can these lights in the heavens, greater and lesser, be used to give signs or regulate seasons, that is Moedim, days and years without observation? He, that is Yahweh, appointed the moon for seasons, that's Moedim. The sun knoweth his going down, that's Psalm 104:19. It shall be established forever as the moon and as the faithful witness in heaven, Selah, that's Psalm 89:37. A faithful witness to what, brethren? Thus saith Yahweh, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinance of the moon and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. That's Yahweh of hosts is his name. Of these ordinances of moon and sun, of moon and stars, depart from before me, saith Yahweh. Then the seed of Israel also shall cease being a nation before me forever. Jeremiah 31, verses 35-36.
So because the ordinances of the moon and stars were commanded by Jehovah, his people are to observe them. And if he stops observing them or ceases to demand their observance, Israel will cease to be a nation from Jehovah forever. Considering that Jehovah does not change, I think the observation of the sun, moon, and stars are still a vital part of Yah's calendar. The ordinances or the law of the sun and moon and stars are spelled out in Genesis 1:14, and these calendar segments are clearly regulated by the sun or moon or both. And we know Isaiah 66:23 says, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith Jehovah. So if there is no aspect of the Father's calendar that is lunar, why are we commanded to observe the new moon days both in the past, like it says in Numbers 10:10, and prophecy reveals that we will also be observing them in the future, Isaiah 66:23, that we just read. So that's the end of the study. I hope you will study yourself, study to be a Berean, and prove the Father's calendar. It's all in Scripture. And thank you for being here today.